When 23-year-old Ethan Carver stood in the clearing, with a red-tailed hawk named Rust perched on his leather-gloved forearm, staring at the 200 acres of Appalachian forest his grandfather had just left him, he had no idea that the collapsing barn at the edge of the property held a secret that would rewrite everything he thought he knew about his family, his future, and the very ground beneath his boots. The inheritance papers said the land was his free and clear, but what Ethan would find hidden in the rotting timbers of that barn 3 days later would reveal that his grandfather had been protecting something far more valuable than timber, and that the fate of an entire mountain community now rested on the shoulders of a young lumberjack who'd spent the last 5 years cutting down trees for a living. Ethan had grown up in Harlan County, Kentucky, in the heart of coal country where the mountains rose steep and the hollows ran deep and dark. His grandfather, Virgil Carver, had been a man of few words and even fewer explanations, a mountain man in the truest sense who'd lived alone on his property for the last 30 years after Ethan's grandmother passed. Ethan had visited maybe twice a year growing up, uncomfortable with the silence and the isolation, preferring the noise and movement of the small town where his mother had moved them after his father left. But every visit, without fail, Virgil would take him into the woods and teach him to read the land, to identify black walnut from white oak, to find ginseng in the undergrowth, to move through the forest like he was part of it rather than an intruder. It was on one of those walks, when Ethan was 18, that they'd found Rust. The hawk had been a nestling, fallen from a cliffside eyrie, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Virgil had splintered it with practiced hands, while Ethan held the terrified bird wrapped in his grandfather's flannel shirt. They'd nursed Rust back to health over 3 months, and when it came time for Ethan to leave, Virgil had simply said, "Bird's yours now. He's chosen you." Ethan had protested that you couldn't keep a wild hawk, that it was probably illegal, but Virgil had given him one of those looks that said the law and the land didn't always agree, and that sometimes you had to know which one mattered more. Rust never fully flew away. He'd hunt on his own, disappear for days sometimes, but he always came back to Ethan's whistle, landing on the glove with those piercing yellow eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's intentions. Over the 5 years since, the hawk had become Ethan's constant companion, riding in the truck when he drove to logging sites, perching in nearby trees while Ethan worked the chainsaw, returning each evening to the small apartment Ethan rented in Harlan. The call about Virgil's death had come on a Tuesday morning in late October. Massive heart attack, the neighbor had said. Went quick. Ethan had felt the grief like a physical weight, not the sharp pain of sudden loss, but the deep ache of opportunities missed, conversations never had, questions never asked. At the funeral, barely a dozen people showed up, mostly old-timers from the mountain who'd known Virgil from decades back. They'd nodded at Ethan with respect that seemed to carry more weight than simple condolence, as if they knew something he didn't, as if Virgil had told them things about his grandson that Ethan himself hadn't known. The lawyer's office in Harlan had been cramped and dusty, run by a man named Tolliver, who'd handled Virgil's affairs for 40 years. He'd handed Ethan the deed to the property with hands that trembled slightly and said, "Your grandfather made me promise to tell you something, son. He said when you got the land, you were to look in the old barn, the one near the eastern property line. Said you'd know what to do with what you found there. Said it was time." Ethan had driven up to the property the next day, Rust riding on his specially designed perch in the passenger seat of his pickup. The narrow gravel road climbed through second-growth forest, past the small cabin where Virgil had lived, and wound another half-mile to the eastern edge where the land bordered national forest. He almost missed the barn. It was so overgrown with kudzu and Virginia creeper, the roof sagging dangerously in the middle. The whole structure looking like a strong wind might finally bring it down after what must have been a century of standing. Ethan had walked around it twice that first day, Rust launching from his arm to perch in a nearby oak, those yellow eyes watching as Ethan examined the weathered boards, the rusted hinges, the door that hung crooked on its frame. He'd peered through gaps in the siding, but saw only darkness and what looked like old farm equipment. Nothing that screamed secret or time-sensitive information. He'd gone back to the cabin, spent the night in his grandfather's bed surrounded by the smell of pipe tobacco and old wood, and tried to make sense of what he was supposed to do with 200 acres of forest when his only skill was cutting trees down. The next morning, he'd returned to the barn with a crowbar, a flashlight, and a determination to fulfill whatever strange last wish his grandfather had left him. Rust had followed, gliding silently between the trees, landing on the barn's roof with a soft thud that sent a shower of rotted shingles sliding to the ground. The door took some work, the wood swollen with decades of moisture, but it finally gave way with a groan that echoed through the clearing. Inside, the barn was larger than it had looked from outside, the interior stretching back into shadow. Old farming tools lined the walls, rusted saws, broken plow blades, coils of rope that had gone stiff with age. But there, in the back corner, Ethan saw something that made his heart kick harder in his chest. Our tarp, newer than anything else in the barn, military green and relatively clean, covered a rectangular shape about the size of a large desk. He'd crossed the space in 4 long strides, Rust calling from the roof as if sensing his excitement. When Ethan pulled the tarp away, dust billowing up in the flashlight beam, he found himself staring at an old roll-top desk that looked like it had been carefully preserved, the wood oiled, the brass hardware polished. It was locked, but the key hung on a nail driven into the post beside it, tagged with a piece of paper that had Ethan's name written in his grandfather's careful script. The desk opened with a smooth click, and inside, Ethan found stacks of papers, leather-bound journals, maps, photographs, and, most surprisingly, a letter addressed to him in an envelope that still felt crisp and new. His hands had trembled as he opened it, and his grandfather's voice seemed to speak through the words written there. "Ethan," the letter began, "if you're reading this, I'm gone and the land is yours. I need you to understand what you've inherited, because it's more than trees and soil. 50 years ago, when the coal companies were buying up every acre they could get their hands on, and the timber corporations were clear-cutting everything that wouldn't be strip-mined, I made a choice. I bought this land with every cent I had, and I've been protecting it ever since. Not just protecting it, documenting it. You'll find in this desk journals that catalog every species of plant, every bird, every salamander and snake and insect I could identify on this property. You'll find maps showing where the old growth still stands, the trees that were here before the first settlers, survivors that the logging companies never found because I hid them, lied about them, did whatever I had to do to keep the chainsaws away." Ethan had to stop reading for a moment, his vision blurring. His grandfather, the quiet man who'd seemed to live such a simple life, had been running a decades-long campaign of conservation deception. The letter continued, "But there's more. In the hollows on the North Ridge, there's a grove of American chestnuts. Real ones, Ethan. Not the Chinese hybrids they're trying to bring back, but originals that somehow survived the blight. I've been protecting them, studying them, collecting their nuts and trying to propagate them for 30 years. I've got specimens growing in hidden spots all over this property. I never told the scientists or the conservation groups because I didn't trust what they'd do, how they'd turn this place into a research station and lose sight of the forest for their data. But I trust you. You know these mountains. You know how to read the land." Ethan's hands were shaking now. American chestnuts, the species that had once dominated the Appalachian forest, providing food for wildlife and humans alike, had been functionally extinct since the blight in the early 1900s. If his grandfather really had found survivors, if he'd been cultivating them, this was bigger than inheritance. This was ecological resurrection. "The timber company that your employer works for," the letter went on, and Ethan felt his stomach drop because he knew where this was headed. "They've been trying to buy this land from me for 20 years. They've got plans to log the whole thing, right up to the national forest boundary. I've turned them down every time, but they're patient and they're ruthless. When I'm gone, they'll come to you with an offer. It'll be generous, probably more money than you've seen in your life. And I won't blame you if you take it, son. You've been making your living with a chainsaw, and I know the guilt you carry about that, even if you've never said it out loud. Your grandmother used to tell me you had the Carver eyes, that you saw the forest the way I did, even when you were small. But life pushed you toward the money, toward the work that was available, and there's no shame in that. But now you've got a choice. You can sell this land and walk away with enough money to start over doing something else, or you can stay. You can protect what I've been protecting. You can be the next guardian of this place." The letter ended with coordinates, marked on one of the maps in the desk, showing the location of the chestnut grove. along with detailed instructions for care and propagation. There was also a thumb drive, which Virgil noted contained all the digital records, photographs, and genetic data I've collected, in case you decide to bring in the scientists after all. Ethan had sat on the barn floor for an hour after reading that letter. The papers spread around him, Rust eventually gliding down to perch on a broken beam overhead. The hawk tilted his head, watching Ethan with what almost seemed like expectation, as if even the bird understood that a decision was being demanded here. The truth was, Ethan had hated logging from the first day. He'd taken the job because it paid better than anything else available to a kid with no college education and a skill for handling tools. But every tree he'd dropped had felt like a small betrayal of those walks with his grandfather, of everything Virgil had tried to teach him about the forest being a living community rather than a commodity. He'd numbed himself to it over 5 years, told himself he was just doing his job, that someone would cut the trees if he didn't, that he needed to make a living. But the guilt had never gone away, and now here was his grandfather, from beyond the grave, offering him a path toward redemption that felt both terrifying and inevitable. The offer from Cascade Timber came 3 days later, just as Virgil had predicted. Ethan was at the cabin, going through the journals his grandfather had left, marveling at the detailed sketches of plants and the careful notes about seasonal changes and animal behavior, when a white SUV pulled up the gravel drive. 2 men got out, both wearing expensive outdoor gear that had never seen actual work. The older one, who introduced himself as Richard Vance, Regional Acquisitions Manager, had a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Carver, please accept our condolences for your loss," Vance had said, shaking Ethan's hand with a grip that tried too hard. "Your grandfather was a stubborn man, but we respected him. I'm here to make you an offer that I think you'll find very fair. Cascade Timber is prepared to purchase your property for $850,000 cash, closing in 30 days. That's well above market value for timberland in this county." Ethan had felt his pulse quicken. $850,000. That was generational wealth for someone like him. That was freedom from the logging job, from the constant worry about money, from the tiny apartment and the truck that needed transmission work he couldn't afford. "I need time to think about it," Ethan had heard himself say, and Vance's smile had tightened. Of course. But I should mention that this offer has an expiration date. 30 days from today. After that, well, land values fluctuate, and we might not be able to be quite so generous. I'm sure you understand." After they left, Ethan had walked up to the North Ridge, following his grandfather's map to the coordinates marked for the chestnut grove. Rust flew ahead, disappearing into the canopy and reappearing, leading the way as if he'd made this journey before. The grove was hidden in a hollow so steep and tangled with rhododendron that Ethan understood why no logger had ever found it. And there they were, 24 mature American chestnut trees, their distinctive leaves still clinging to branches in the late October air, their unmistakable bark rough and deeply furrowed. Ethan had pressed his hand against one of them and felt tears he didn't expect sliding down his face. These trees had been standing here when his great-great-grandparents had first come to this mountain. They'd survived when millions of their kind had died. And his grandfather had found them, protected them, kept their secret for 3 decades. The weight of that stewardship now falling on Ethan's shoulders felt crushing and sacred all at once. That night he'd made a decision. He called his boss at the logging company and quit, effective immediately. Then he'd sat down with the journals and the maps and started making a plan. If he was going to keep this land, he needed to find a way to make it sustainable, to generate enough income that he wouldn't be forced to sell off pieces of it over the years. His grandfather's notes mentioned sustainable forestry practices, selective harvesting that could bring in some money without destroying the ecosystem. There were also mentions of ginseng cultivation, of ecotourism possibilities, of partnerships with conservation groups. But first, he needed to understand exactly what he was protecting. Over the next 2 weeks, Ethan walked every acre of the property, Rust on his shoulder or flying overhead, both of them mapping the land in a way that combined his grandfather's meticulous documentation with Ethan's own understanding of the forest. He found the scattered chestnut seedlings Virgil had been cultivating in hidden locations. He found a spring-fed creek that ran clear and cold, home to native brook trout. He found rock outcroppings covered in rare lichens and fern species. He found places where black bears had marked trees and where bobcats had made dens. The land was a treasure, a refuge, a living archive of what the Appalachian forest had once been before industry got its teeth into it. On the 15th day, a different visitor arrived. She drove an old Subaru covered in conservation organization stickers, and she introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Chen, a botanist from the University of Kentucky. She was younger than Ethan had expected, maybe early 30s, with soil under her fingernails and eyes that lit up when she talked about plants. "I knew your grandfather," she said, standing on the cabin's small porch. "Not well, but we corresponded. He emailed me about 5 years ago with some photographs of trees he wanted help identifying. When I realized what he'd found, I begged him to let me come study them, but he refused. Said the time wasn't right, that the land needed a different kind of guardian first. He said when that guardian was in place, he'd make sure I got access. I'm hoping you're that guardian. Mr. Carver." Ethan had invited her in, made coffee, and listened as she explained what the American chestnut grove could mean for restoration efforts across the entire Appalachian range. If Virgil's trees had genuine blight resistance, if their genetics could be studied and propagated, it could change everything. But she was careful to emphasize that it would have to be done right, with Ethan maintaining control of the land, with protections in place that would prevent it from becoming just another research station that forgot the forest in favor of the data. "I've seen what you're up against," Dr. Chen had said. "Cascade Timber has a reputation for aggressive acquisition. They'll push hard, and if you refuse them, they'll look for other ways to get what they want. Timber rights, easements, legal challenges to your deed. You need protection, and you need it fast. Have you considered a conservation easement?" Ethan admitted he barely knew what that meant, and Dr. Chen had spent the next hour explaining how he could deed the development rights to a land trust while retaining ownership, protecting the property in perpetuity, while also getting a significant tax break that would help make keeping the land financially viable. She had contacts, she said, organizations that specialized in exactly this kind of situation. Over the next week, working with Dr. Chen and a lawyer she connected him with, Ethan began the process of placing a conservation easement on the property. It was complex and slow, but it felt right. He also reached out to the Kentucky Division of Forestry about sustainable harvest permits for select sections of second-growth timber, far from the old growth and the chestnut groves. A forester came out, walked the land with Ethan, and agreed that selective harvesting could bring in modest income without compromising the ecological integrity of the property. Rust seemed to sense the change in Ethan's purpose. The hawk became more active, hunting the clearings and meadows, bringing down rabbits and squirrels with lethal precision, as if demonstrating that the land could provide if you understood it well enough. Ethan started documenting Rust's hunting patterns, adding to his grandfather's journals, feeling the continuity of observation and care that stretched backward to Virgil, and now forward through himself. When Richard Vance called on day 28, 2 days before the offer's expiration, Ethan was ready. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Vance, but I'm not selling. The land stays in the family, and it stays forested." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Vance's voice came back, colder now, the friendly veneer gone. "That's disappointing, Mr. Carver. I hope you understand what you're turning down. That's a lot of money to walk away from out of sentimentality." "It's not sentimentality," Ethan had said. "First responsibility." The pushback came faster than he'd expected. Within a week, Cascade Timber announced plans to log the National Forest parcel adjacent to Ethan's eastern boundary, a tract they'd apparently purchased timber rights 2 years ago. The logging operation would bring heavy equipment within yards of his property line, would build access roads that would fragment wildlife habitat, would destroy the buffer that had helped protect his land's integrity. Ethan attended the public comment meeting in Harlan, standing up in a room full of loggers, men he'd worked alongside, men who needed the jobs this operation would provide, and spoke against the plan. He'd brought maps, his grandfather's documentation, photographs of the chestnut grove that Dr. Chen had helped him take. He'd explained what was at stake, not just for his land, but for the entire region's ecological heritage. The room had been divided. Some of the old-timers had nodded, remembering Virgil and the way the mountains had been before the clear cuts. But the younger workers, the men with families to feed and bills to pay, had looked at Ethan like he was a traitor. One of them, a guy named Danny Shepherd, who Ethan had shared a chainsaw crew with, had stood up and said, "Easy for you to talk about conservation when you just inherited a fortune in land, Carver. Some of us still have to work for a living." It had stung because it wasn't entirely wrong. Ethan had been in their position, had understood the desperation that made cutting down old-growth forest feel justified. But he'd also seen what his grandfather had protected, had felt the weight of stewardship that came with the inheritance. The deciding factor came from an unexpected source. At the end of the meeting, an elderly woman named Martha Tackett had stood up, her voice quavering but clear. "My daddy worked in the chestnuts before the blight," she'd said. "I remember him bringing home nuts in bushel baskets. Remember the way the whole forest would smell sweet when they were blooming. I remember when the blight came through and he cried watching those giants die. If Virgil Carver found survivors, if his grandson's trying to protect them, then we owe it to our children to help him. The logging jobs will last 5 years, maybe 10. Those trees could last 500 years. I know which future I want to leave." The room had gone quiet, and Ethan had seen something shift in people's faces. The Forest Service ultimately delayed the logging permit, pending an environmental review that Dr. Chen and her university colleagues had requested. It wasn't a permanent victory, but it was breathing room. That winter, Ethan threw himself into the work of learning to be a different kind of forester. He took online courses in conservation biology and sustainable land management. He built relationships with local conservation groups and discovered a network of people who'd been quietly doing the same work his grandfather had done, protecting small parcels, documenting rare species, fighting against the industrial extraction that had dominated Appalachian land use for a century and a half. Dr. Chen returned in the spring with a small research team, and they spent 2 weeks carefully studying the chestnut grove, taking genetic samples, measuring growth rates, documenting the tree's health. What they found was remarkable. The trees showed strong resistance to the blight fungus, not complete immunity, but enough to survive and reproduce. More than that, the grove's understory was thick with seedlings, natural regeneration that suggested the resistance was being passed down. "This is a game changer," Dr. Chen had told Ethan, sitting on the cabin porch while Rust preened on his perch nearby. "With your permission, we could begin a careful propagation program, using seeds and cuttings from these trees to establish new groves on protected land throughout the region. We're talking about restoration on a scale that most people thought was impossible, but there was a catch. The research would bring attention. Already, word was spreading through academic and conservation circles about the discovery. Cascade timber had ears everywhere, and it wouldn't take long for them to understand exactly why Ethan's land was valuable beyond its timber. The second offer came in June, delivered not by Richard Vance but by a lawyer, found this time the number was $2 million. The letter made clear that if Ethan refused, Cascade would pursue legal action, claiming that Virgil had fraudulently concealed the property's true value when negotiating timber assessments years ago, that the deed transfer might be invalid, that environmental regulations might require the chestnut grove to be placed under federal protection, which could trigger eminent domain. Ethan had taken the letter to his own lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia Doss, who'd been helping with the conservation easement. She'd read it carefully and set it down with a grim expression. "They're bluffing on most of this," she'd said, "but they can make your life hell with legal fees even if they lose. This is a war of attrition. They're betting you don't have the resources to fight." "Do I?" Ethan had asked. Patricia had smiled. "You've got something better. You've got a story that people care about. You've got a discovery that matters. And you've got a community that's starting to remember what they've lost and what they could get back." She'd been right. When news of Cascade's legal threats leaked to the regional press, the response was swift. The Louisville Courier-Journal ran a feature on Ethan and the chestnut grove, framing it as a David and Goliath story of a young conservationist fighting corporate greed to save a piece of Appalachian heritage. The story was picked up by the Associated Press, then by national environmental publications. Suddenly, Ethan was doing interviews explaining his grandfather's legacy, talking about the importance of protecting what little old-growth forest remained. Donations started coming in to a legal defense fund that Patricia had helped establish. Not huge amounts, but $20 here, $50 there, from people across the country who connected with the story. Conservation organizations offered their own lawyers and resources. A filmmaker contacted Ethan about doing a documentary. The attention was overwhelming and uncomfortable for someone who'd spent most of his life trying to stay out of the spotlight. But he understood its strategic value. Cascade Timber quietly dropped their legal threats in August, but Ethan knew the war wasn't over. Companies like that didn't give up, they just changed tactics. Sure enough, in September, a new player emerged. A development company called Mountain Heritage Estates announced plans for a luxury eco-resort on property, adjacent to both Ethan's land and the National Forest. The development would bring jobs, they promised, and economic growth to a county that desperately needed both. It would also bring roads, water runoff, light pollution, and human traffic that would destroy the ecological integrity of the entire area. This time, Ethan didn't fight alone. The network of conservationists and local allies he'd been building mobilized. They packed county commission meetings, submitted detailed environmental impact concerns, and organized a grassroots campaign that framed the issue not as development versus conservation, but as outside exploitation versus local stewardship. The turning point came at a town hall in October, almost exactly a year after Virgil's death. Ethan stood in front of 200 people, rust on his gloved arm because he'd learned that the hawk's presence was powerful symbolism, and spoke not from notes but from his heart. My grandfather spent 50 years protecting a piece of forest that most people forgot could even exist anymore, he'd said. He didn't do it for money or recognition. He did it because he understood that we're part of this land, not separate from it. The jobs that logging and development bring are real, and the need for them is real, but they're temporary. They extract value and move on. What I'm proposing is different. I want to build something permanent. I want to create jobs that last, that regenerate instead of deplete. Sustainable forestry that provides timber without clear-cutting. Ecotourism that brings people to experience the forest without destroying it. Research partnerships that bring university money into the community. A tree nursery that could propagate American chestnuts and sell them across the eastern United States. None of this will make anyone rich quick, but it will still be here in 50 years, and it will still be ours. The applause had been scattered at first, then building, and when Ethan sat down, he'd felt something shift in the room's energy. Martha Tackett had been there, nodding with tears in her eyes. Danny Shepard, the logger who'd called him out a year ago, had approached afterward and said, "I still think you're crazy, Carver, but maybe the kind of crazy we need." The development proposal stalled in committee, delayed by environmental reviews and permitting questions. Meanwhile, Ethan moved forward with his own plans. With Dr. Chen's help, he established the Virgil Carver American Chestnut Conservancy, a small non-profit dedicated to propagating and studying the grove's trees. The first seedlings were already growing in a small nursery he'd built on the property, hardy young trees that would eventually be planted on protected land across Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia, and North Carolina. He also began leading small groups on guided hikes through the property, sharing his grandfather's knowledge and his own growing expertise. The groups were limited to 6 people, by reservation only, with all proceeds going back into land management. The first few months were slow, but word spread. People came from across the region, then from across the country, to see the chestnut grove, to hear the story, to experience a piece of forest that felt like stepping back in time. One of those visitors in the spring of his second year on the land was a young woman named Riley McAllister, who ran a sustainable agriculture non-profit in Lexington. She'd grown up in Appalachia, she told Ethan as they hiked up to the North Ridge, and had spent her career trying to find ways to help mountain communities build economies that didn't depend on extraction. When she saw the chestnut grove, saw the work Ethan was doing, she looked at him with an intensity that made his heart kick in his chest and said, "You know you're sitting on a model that could be replicated across the entire region, right? This could be bigger than just your land." They'd started talking, first about conservation and community economics, then about everything else. Riley understood the mountains in a way that most people Ethan met didn't. Understood the complicated love for a place that had been both home and trap for generations of families. She started visiting most weekends, helping with the nursery, bringing expertise in grant writing and non-profit management that Ethan desperately needed. Rust approved of her immediately, which Ethan took as a sign worth trusting. By the third year, the land had become something his grandfather might not have imagined, but would certainly have approved of. The conservation easement was finalized, protecting the property in perpetuity. The sustainable forestry operation was bringing in modest but steady income. The nursery was selling chestnut seedlings to conservation organizations and private landowners across 6 states. The guided hikes were booked months in advance. 3 graduate students were conducting research on the property, studying everything from salamander populations to forest regeneration patterns. And Ethan had hired 2 local workers, both former loggers, to help with land management and nursery operations. The cabin had been expanded into a small education center with solar panels on the roof and a rainwater collection system that Ethan and Riley had designed together. On the walls hung enlarged photographs from Virgil's journals, alongside current photos showing the same locations, a visual timeline of the land's protection and recovery. School groups started coming in the fall and spring. Children from Harlan and Lexington and everywhere in between, learning about forest ecology and conservation, planting seedling chestnuts that they could return to visit as they grew. Ethan still worked with his hands, still felt most himself in the forest with soil under his boots and rust overhead, but the work had changed. Instead of cutting down, he was building up. Instead of extracting, he was nurturing. The guilt that had shadowed his logging years had transformed into something else, a sense of purpose that felt aligned with the land rather than opposed to it. One evening in late October, 4 years to the day after he'd first read his grandfather's letter in the old barn, Ethan stood in the chestnut grove with Riley beside him, and Rust perched on a low branch nearby. The trees were heavy with nuts, their spiny husks beginning to split open and drop their glossy brown fruit to the forest floor. In a month, they'd collect them, stratify them over the winter, and plant them in the spring, continuing the cycle that Virgil had started and that Ethan now stewarded. "You ever wonder what your life would be like if you'd sold?" Riley asked, slipping her hand into his. Ethan had thought about it, especially in the early days when the legal threats had seemed overwhelming and the financial pressure had been crushing. $850,000 would have bought a different kind of freedom, one without constant worry about budgets and permits and legal protections. But standing here, watching Rust launch from the branch and glide through the cathedral of trees that his grandfather had saved and that he was now protecting, Ethan couldn't imagine making any other choice. "I'd have been comfortable," he said, "but I wouldn't have been alive the way I am now." Riley squeezed his hand, and they stood in silence as the light faded through the canopy and the forest settled into its evening rhythms. Somewhere in the distance, a barred owl called. Rust answered with his own cry, and the sound echoed through the hollow like a promise being kept, a covenant between the land and those who loved it enough to put its survival above their own immediate gain. The work was far from finished. Cascade Timber still owned timber rights on adjacent properties. Development pressure in Appalachia was only increasing as people looked for cheap rural land. Climate change was bringing new pests and diseases that threatened even resistant trees. But Ethan had learned what his grandfather must have known all along. That conservation wasn't a single act, but a sustained commitment, a daily choice to protect rather than exploit, to build rather than extract, to think in terms of generations rather than quarters. The Chestnut Conservancy had grown beyond anything Ethan had initially imagined. Collaborations with universities had brought in research funding. Partnerships with other conservation organizations had expanded the network of protected land. The story of the young lumberjack who'd inherited a forest and chosen to save it rather than sell it had inspired similar efforts across Appalachia and beyond. Ethan got emails weekly from people asking for advice, wanting to know how they could do the same thing on their own land. He and Riley had started leading workshops, teaching others the practical skills of conservation land management and the bureaucratic navigation of easements and permits and non-profit structures. It was exhausting and exhilarating, and Ethan often thought about how strange it was that he'd become an educator when he'd barely made it through high school, that he'd become a conservationist when he'd spent 5 years logging, that he'd become a guardian of one of the most ecologically significant parcels in the region when he'd spent most of his early life trying to escape these mountains. But maybe that was the point. Maybe you had to leave to understand what you'd lost. Maybe you had to participate in the destruction to fully comprehend what salvation required. Maybe you had to be offered an easy way out to understand that some things were worth the hard path. On the 5-year anniversary of Virgil's death, Ethan organized a celebration on the property. More than 100 people came, a mix of conservationists and community members, researchers and former logging colleagues who'd made their own transitions into different kinds of land work. Martha Tackett was there, now in her 90s, but still sharp, still telling stories about the chestnuts of her childhood. Dr. Chen was there with her team, presenting 5 years of research data that confirmed what Virgil had documented decades ago. The trees were thriving, reproducing, demonstrating blight resistance that was being passed to the next generation. Danny Shepard was there too, working now as Ethan's land manager, overseeing the sustainable forestry operation with a convert's zeal. "Who would have thought," he'd said to Ethan earlier that day watching a group of kids on a nature walk, "that we'd end up making more money and employing more people by not clear-cutting than we ever did when we were logging full-time." The numbers bore it out. The combination of sustainable timber harvest, nursery sales, ecotourism, research partnerships, and educational programming generated more annual revenue than the property would have produced under conventional forestry, and it did so in a way that increased rather than decreased the land's value over time. It wasn't a model that would make anyone rich, but it was a model that was working, and more importantly, it was a model that other landowners were starting to adopt. As the sun set behind the ridge and someone started a bonfire in the clearing near the cabin, Ethan found himself thinking about his grandfather, about the lonely decades Virgil had spent protecting this place with no guarantee that anyone would continue the work after he was gone. The faith that must have required, the hope that his grandson, a kid who'd grown up to work for the very industry Virgil opposed, would somehow understand and choose correctly. When the moment came, rust descended from the darkening sky as the fire crackled to life, landing on Ethan's outstretched arm with familiar weight. The hawk's eyes reflected the firelight, and Ethan wondered what the bird saw when he looked out over this land. Whether he understood in his own way that this was a refuge, a sanctuary, a promise kept across generations. Riley appeared at Ethan's side, slipping under his free arm, and together they watched the gathering, listened to the stories and laughter, felt the warmth of community built around shared purpose. This was what inheritance really meant, Ethan understood now. Not just the transfer of property, but the transfer of responsibility, of knowledge, of care. His grandfather had given him more than 200 acres of forest. He'd given him a mission, an identity, a way of being in the world that honored the land rather than consuming it. The old barn where Ethan had found his grandfather's letter had finally collapsed the previous winter under the weight of snow and time. But before it fell, Ethan had salvaged the roll-top desk, had moved it into the education center where it now held copies of Virgil's journals for visitors to read. The original journals were in climate-controlled storage at the university, being digitized and studied, but the desk remained here, a tangible connection to the man who'd started it all. Sometimes Ethan would sit at that desk in the early morning, before the day's work began, would run his hands over the wood his grandfather had touched, would feel the presence of the man he'd never fully known in life, but had come to understand through his careful documentation and his patient protection of this extraordinary place. And sometimes he'd add his own notes to the ongoing journals he kept, recording changes in the forest, new species observed, phenological shifts that might indicate climate impacts, continuing the chronicle that Virgil had begun. The story wasn't finished. It would never be finished as long as someone remained to carry it forward. But sitting there with Riley beside him and rust on his arm, watching firelight play across the faces of people who'd gathered to celebrate what could be saved and what could be restored, Ethan felt something like peace. Not the peace of rest, but the peace of right action, of living in alignment with values that went deeper than money or comfort or ease. The young lumberjack, who'd once cut down trees for money, had become a conservationist who grew them instead. The hawk who'd fallen from a nest with a broken leg had become the symbol of a restoration project that stretched across state lines. The old man who died alone in a mountain cabin had become the founding father of a movement that was reimagining what Appalachian land use could look like in the 21st century. And the barn's secret, that letter and those journals and the maps to hidden groves, had changed everything, exactly as it was meant to do. As the night deepened and the stars emerged above the ridge, Ethan released Rust into the darkness. The hawk circled once, twice, 3 times above the gathering, his silhouette briefly blocking constellations, and then disappeared into the forest to hunt. He'd return by morning, as he always did, drawn back by bonds that transcended the wild and the tame, the free and the committed, finding in that return not captivity but home. And that, Ethan thought, was the lesson of the land itself. That freedom wasn't the absence of connection, but the presence of chosen obligation. That wealth wasn't measured in what you could take, but in what you could protect. That inheritance wasn't about receiving, but about accepting the responsibility to pass forward something better than what you'd been given. His grandfather had understood that. The hawk seemed to understand it in his own way, and now Ethan understood it too, bone deep, soul certain, as permanent as the chestnuts growing in the hollow, and as enduring as the mountains themselves. If Ethan's story moved you, if it made you think about what we owe to the land and to the future, I need you to do something right now. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and make sure you activate the notifications bell so you never miss stories like this. These are stories about people choosing the hard right over the easy wrong, about protecting what matters even when it costs them something, about building legacies that last beyond a single lifetime. And drop a comment below. I want to know, if you inherited land like Ethan did, what would you do? Would you take the money and start fresh somewhere else? Or would you stay and fight to protect it? What does stewardship mean to you in your own life, even if you don't own 200 acres of forest? Share your thoughts, because this conversation matters and your perspective adds to it. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, someone who's struggling with a big decision or trying to figure out what really matters in their life, share this video with them. Stories like Ethan's remind us that we're all guardians of something, whether it's land or community or knowledge or values, and that the choice to protect what we've been given is always available to us, no matter how much pressure we're under to do otherwise. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.